Okay, here's one that begins kind of with a question and might be quite revealing. The question begins, how old is ice? Well, that's a kind of funny question. There's probably been ice around since before there was even a solar system here for us, or Earth, or even on Earth there being ice. When were people making ice? How about that? Here we're looking at an old ice house, as they used to call them, in Macon, Georgia, not too far away from where my parents grew up, but it's from 1877, much before their date. But I remember them telling a lot of tales, and even being at my grandparents' house one time when I was quite young. I guess I was 5 or 6. It seems like it was the year, it was, about 5 or 6. And they showed me what used to be a refrigerator back in the day. Now, we had a new refrigerator at the time at our house, and if I remember, it was kind of a beige almond color, enameled, and a separate refrigerator and refreezer. Wasn't a two-in-one situation. But my grandparents, over at their house, they had an old refrigerator called a Korg. And it looked like the hood off a taxi cab, and it was painted avocado green. Does anybody know or remember anything of this time? Well, they had something that looked like that also out of enamel that was off in this side room that they had, off of the room that she did the washing and drying and ironing and stuff in. And they still had this thing. And they had it in that room because that's where it goes, because there was a drain on it that went through the floor. And it was an ice box. And this ice box, I should show a picture of one right now, but this ice box looked just like a refrigerator or freezer that we would have today, with a big refrigerator and then a little freezer on top, except for the freezer on top was empty, and it was all like aluminum tin covered and everything in it. But what you stuck in there was a giant block of ice that barely fit into this thing, and you closed the door, and it seeped its cold air, which cold air falls, right? And it fell down into the bottom chamber, and you didn't open and close this, and Grandma and Granddad got ape mad. You had to know what you were going at before you ever opened this thing. And they had this go on with the refrigerator and so on. It went on until I was growing up too, because it happened to my parents, and so they passed it on, and so it continues. But it wouldn't get things quite frozen, but it sure was a refrigerator for the time. And just like they had certain boxes that you put onions in and things like that that kept them away from the moisture, and also kept them away from sunlight, and then other vegetables they would want to keep out in sunlight, even putting tomatoes up on windowsills and getting them ripened, and all these ideas they had on when I was a kid. It's one of the things that was weird to me, because they didn't used to have air conditioning. And my granddad told me about it while we were in his room, and they had an air conditioner at the time for the house, but it was about half-ass. And so they still had extra wall units, because they had some big rooms, and they had one in their bedroom wall, a wall unit that stuck outside and kicked on and got going. And whenever it kicked on, you had to turn up the TV a little bit, and this was back whenever you had to get your ass up and turn the TV up a little bit. But how long have people been making ice? You see, because that was in Atlanta, Georgia, and they used to get ice there, and I was thinking right off the bat that at winter they had ice there, because I was there, and they had snow and the whole 9 yards. But we're in this middle of summer, and so where would you be getting ice from? Because people didn't have refrigerators. He had just talked about it. Well, come to find out about it, there were these ice houses that used to keep ice from the winter time, and they would take whenever big lakes froze over, and they would chop up and cube this ice up and use these big ice tongs to pull it up out of the water. Like if you've ever seen Frozen, when they're doing that and getting that ice together, that would have been sure for that little festival right there, and making chipped ice things and sorbets or whatever. But that actually would have been put into a room that you didn't open, and it didn't breathe very much at all either, and you only got into it to pull out certain stuff at certain times, and it was going to be something that kept your stuff going real good. And we know there was a salt curing going on a lot of times, and that goes extremely well back farther as far as curing something like that, or jerky and freeze drying something, which leads later into our discussion on this. But how long have people been making ice? And it might surprise you if you've never looked into it or thought about it or found out about it or heard of any of the ancient tales and stories of it. But this ice, these people could keep from the winter and stuff, but also people would have these caves that, because of the way the wind ran through there and so on, it would cause an evaporative cooling, and if there was moisture in the cave going to it, but a small amount, and not too much humidity outside versus it, it would make the cave get extremely cold. People would, in ancient times, even put their foods in there and things like that and save them in there, but of course then you got to worry about animals coming in there. So when do you think that we started building ice? I mean, this is almost like the where are we thing, where I want you to put down there when you think that we first started making ice. Don't be embarrassed about a wrong answer or anything. I surely got this wrong until I found out about something, but it was much younger. We'll talk about that later. I know the way I sound right now, it makes you want to go for a deep date. Would it surprise you to know that in the Renaissance, people would have parties where they would have ice? One of the tales that's told in a few situations going on is that this punch bowl or whatever was iced, and it wasn't that they had thrown chunks of ice in it, just exactly like you would think, but this punch bowl was apparently set in the place that made this so cold that it froze halfway, and then they put it up in the place and it slowly thawed away, like ice sculptures and so on. In fact, a few of these tales involve the idea of people having some ice sculptures and ice things, and they were all enamored on messing with ice. There are tales of ice houses going back through 1000 BC and so on that people are well aware of. Some, if you get into the idea of it. But how far could it go back? Well, let's stretch back through it here a little bit. Here's an ice house. Since you know that I usually talk about stuff that's around me here, I did something about Georgia there, but let's talk about southern ice houses real quick. In Texas, former ice houses are cultural traditions. Ice merchants diversified to sell groceries and cold beer, serving as early convenience stores and local gathering places. The widespread 7-Eleven chain of convenience stores in the U.S., first known as totem stores, developed from ice houses, operated from the Southland Ice Manufacturing Company in Dallas and in San Antonio in the 1930s. Yeah, the Southland Corporation that you always heard about, and muscular dystrophy, whenever they were doing that and everything, that actually stemmed off of ice houses. And of course they do have a lot of beverages and things like that that go in there, and frozen things that you can get, but It stemmed off of that originally. Many Texas ice houses have since converted into open-air bars, and in central Texas, southeast Texas, especially the Houston area and the Texas Hill Country, the word ice house has become colloquialism for an establishment that derives the majority of its income from the sale of cold beer. Well, I come to find out, my dad was into all kinds of Western things and stuff back in the day, right? And that's where I got a lot of my interest in that, but also it kind of drove me into the other way because he was so deep into it. I got to find out a lot of things about it, but there were a few places, in fact, a place as desolate as Tucson, Arizona, that supposedly at one time had ice going on. Ice for drinks. He had a book about all kinds of gunfights and the stupid reasons they had broke out and so on. Well, there was a poker game and what had happened and all these things. And one of them was over an iced drink that was, I'm guessing, whiskey on ice. So this idea of having a cold one, a lot of these places that you would see as a saloon or so on would have a cellar down below there, like you would think of as a wine cellar, and it would keep a lot of the things refrigerated and cooled off and from flies getting into it and so on, but also it'd have a very cooling effect to it, being down in the ground, regardless of whether you were in Tucson or not. You get a couple layers down inside of there and you get insulated somewhat, and you get some quite refreshing times. But then somewhere up in the mountains, a lot of times it would get near cold, and you could build this little building that looked kind of like a beehive. If you did it right, you could make a block of ice, or you could make a bucket turn into a bucket of ice pretty easy. Something that you could hardly get into. It looked like a hearth. People that found them thought they were little Mexican hearth type things, or Indians, where they would put it into. The weird thing is there's no association with burning of them. And through my studies, I found other places that had that same look, but yet they aren't associated with burning either. We'll get there in a minute. Southland, though, the 7-Eleven Corporation, was not the only company in southern U.S. to develop convenience store corporation from ice businesses. Munford Incorporated of Atlanta began in the early 20th century by vending both ice and coal from mule-drawn wagons as the Atlantic Ice and Coal Company. And by the 1970s, Munford was operating a large chain of convenience stores with the name Magic Market. The company was sold out in 1988 and then filed bankruptcy in 1990, so they couldn't hold their head above water whenever that happened. Wonder if anybody listening remembers these places. So you can see some of these old places like this, and here's a 1930s commercial ice house where apparently this side of it was all the ice house, and this part you would go in and get your stuff for it, because they had to have a few little barriers in there to keep it cold, and they'd have it covered with sawdust, and so that helped keep it real cold, and you'd be surprised how long it lasts by doing it like that. But there are places that go back much earlier than that. In Europe, in Bedfordshire, which is really a cave-like built-in structure that goes down into the ground somewhat, utilizing both of the effects. Here's one in Scotland, in England in County Park, with the initials MW on it. But it looks like a little burrow and some little hobbit hut type situation, but it leads definitely down into what people would probably call a root cellar or a wine cellar or something like that. But people were actually collecting during the winter ice and snow and putting it in there, and then whenever it was utilized back out of it for special occasions, and keeping food on ice and things like that, as it was needed all the way through the summer until the next season. And you'd be surprised, but sometimes these things would have ice to last that long, especially if they were built correctly and then they didn't have too much interaction with them. So if you had a secondary ice house, or a lot of these ice houses had a secondary room in it that you would have, that you would only get into at certain times, but even if you opened up the door in there, because you were still in the enclosed area, it didn't ruin it so bad, and you had another ability to close it again, almost like a freezer and refrigerator situation. You can see this one built into a side hill right here near a castle called Arsen Castle in the Netherlands. Now, you wouldn't think that they would need it, but this is the way that it looks in spring through summer through fall. And it looks like we're at fall here and all the leaves have gone down. But here in a couple of months, they're going to have a bunch of ice. And there's a river bed right here that you're running through that it looks like here to the left. But I bet you there's a lake right near there, and they would grab those ice, put it on sleds, and drag it up here just like Sven. And then take those ice cubes and put it into there and cover it with sawdust that they had saved from the workings. Yeah, and so how far does this go back? Well, it goes well far back, Florence, Italy, in fact, and there are Roman times where, well, there's one time where it talks about at the festival leading before Saturnalia, kind of like a Thanksgiving situation that they had going at the time that they had ice. And this wasn't because it was an early winter. In fact, it was part of the marvels that they had going on there. It's just mentioned as a side note, but if you think about things in a correct way, that's quite the thing. How far does ice go back? Well, you know me, I draw things out a little bit too much, don't I? As we went back through time, let's come back up here to a modern time and ice, and now we have all these machines and stuff, but they work off this evaporative cooling and concepts that have been coming back from a Wayback Machine. And in fact, the earliest forms that we have that we can document, other than deep caves that might have been used for such and such, which they all call root cellars, is what's known as a Yakhchal. Yakhchal. These are these beehive type structures that are found all around through Iran and ancient Persia. And the remnants of some of these have been found, but whenever you find it, you're finding either a square or a circle. And it's impregnated in the ground, and there appears to be a well that's there that appears to be nowhere deep enough to possibly reach the water table, or even where you thought the water table was in ancient times. But they had something going on. And again, a lot of times they look at this thing and they say, well, that's a smokestack at the top of it right there, and this place was like a, place to smoke meats, or it was to do this or do that, and they go exactly the opposite concept and say it was for heating some way, or to keep people warm overnight situations. But doesn't it also have a termite mound type effect going on to it? There's all kinds of neat things about this. They're made out of a special clay mix. And we'll get into this here real quick. Let's look at this. So this Yakhchal. If I was to go to a Yakhchal, Yak means ice, and chal means pit in ancient Persian, so they have that Yakhchal. It's an ancient type of ice house that functioned as an evaporative cooler, kind of like an air conditioner works today. They have the compressor and evaporative cooler. The way it works is like a car, if you've ever had that part of it break down. Above ground, the structure had a dome shape, but it had a subterranean storage space. It's often used to store ice, but sometimes was used to store food as well. The subterranean space, coupled with the thick, heat-resistant construction material, insulated the storage space year-round. These structures were mainly built and used in Persia and were built hundreds of years ago, and they still remain standing. But yet, there have been remnants of these things found thousands of years ago. In fact, some of these times, I'm telling you, there's one famous video that I've got that showed ancient Aryans in the edge of Pakistan and India, if you will, and their ancient buildings there and horse burials, and them finding soma and remnants of the ancient drink and what it was made out of. But yet they find this pit that's there, and it's the same type situation where they had a few of these going on, but the whole top part of it's gone now. And so they had questions as to what it had to do with, but they had this pit that's dug down into them, and they're thinking, okay, well, they walked down there and got the water, but it's nowhere near the water table. In fact, over here they have a main well type thing that goes down, and instead of being 35 foot like that, the well goes down 45, 50 foot. And then it looks like that as the water ran out there, which that's the reason everybody ditched it from this area, they dug down even deeper. So why would the houses have any of that? And of course some people said, oh, they're refrigeration, or they're putting food in and so on else. But you know, the reality of it is they actually had this Yakhchals situation going on, and people had air conditioned houses somewhat hooked up to this, and the bleed that runs off of this, because what you do is if you run the thing correctly. Let me see if I can show and talk to you about this a little bit. And this beehive, it's got a little valve hole at the top of it, and you can let the thing breathe. And because that's heat wanting to go up, regardless of the regular parts of the temperature, it's going to try to breathe in from the bottom, and you can valve that all the way down through the cold air. And so by doing that, you can replace the heat that's latent in the top third of it or so. And in doing so, you can get real cold by taking out the heat and doing it over a period of time and getting it down. And if you do it overnight and so on, you can get it down to real cold. And if you make it to where nobody opens the door or does anything, you can get ice to form in water overnight, and then you can keep it right on the edge of that. And if you have that structure at that temperature, and then do it night after night, you can sit and procure ice. Yeah, this is at Kashmir in Iran, like Kashmir, like it's Kashmir in Iran. Out in the desert, as far away as you can think from the ability of being able to make ice as possible as you can. And the ancient Sumerians had figured out how to make ice that long ago, along with Persians. And these beehive structures that look like this. Here's one in Maybad, Iran. These are still working to this day. Here's what it looks like when you're inside, but not down in the pit, looking up inside of it right there. And so you can see that valve and chimney idea that it gets going on. Here's another one built into the structure of this. But let's look at a few more things. They'll tell you that they can be up to 180,000 cubic foot, where it says it right here. And these volume of them, and it's made of a special unique water-resistant mortar called sarouj, which is composed of sand, clay, egg whites, lime, and goat hair and ash in specific proportions. It has to be made correctly, and that that's resistant to heat transfer, almost like the bricks on the space shuttle or whatever, where it doesn't allow heat transfer in situations. So on the outside the sun could be cooking, and in fact the differential between the two and the fact that it is so arid and not humid allows it to have this effect. I've also heard that it has an extreme effect with the desert sky and the way there's nothing there, and that effect at night is what sucks all the heat out of it. It actually has a transference effect up into the sky, radiating off, and by doing that it utilizes this. And while it's going on, due to this technology that we're talking about, they're able to get better than 15 to 30 degrees difference from the outside temperature. So whenever you find things getting in the 40s and 50s at night in the desert, which is normally way the hell warm, but then it gets cold at night, you can find places where it'll edge on and you can make ice. It's amazing. There's some tales that talk about them being able to make ice in ancient times and even in the Sumerians. And there's one where he's boasting about it, and I thought it was mentioned here, but let's see. It might be back on this page. A cuneiform tablet from 1780 BC records the construction of an ice house by Zimri Lim, the king of Mari, in the northern Mesopotamian town of Turka, which he says never had any king built before. In China, archaeologists have found remains of ice pits from 7th century BC, and references suggested that they were in use before 1100 BC. Alexander the Great stored snow in pits dug for that purpose around 300 BC, and in Rome, in the 3rd century AD, snow was imported from the mountains and stored in straw-covered pits and sold from snow shops. The ice that formed in the bottom of these pits was sold at a higher price than the snow on top due to it being packed in a solid ice form. But then again, you'd have them where they packed snow and then they got lake ice, and the lake ice would be worth more, but maybe a different way of looking at it there. But there are ideas of sorbets being made, and you're like, how the hell did they make sorbet back then? Because that's like shave ice with all this stuff into it. I don't care how rich the guy is. Don't tell me they went up in a mountain and did all these things. Yeah, somebody brought a block of ice all the way down, making it happen. It's incredible. But even more important than that, these little dome houses we're talking about that are kind of like a beehive or a termite mound that you can find even in deepest of Africa that have this shape that looks somewhat like that and a few holes in it, and it breathes just right and it keeps it cool just to the right temperature on the inside, doesn't it? You can go in this thing and it's like going into a big air-conditioned room, and well, they're pretty big on the inside, and you're in air conditioning in the middle of the desert. It's just quite amazing. So how long does ice making go back? Well, it goes back, 1780 BC, about 4,000 years ago, almost, here reaching back on it. But it looks like it would have gone back maybe a little sooner than that. And somewhere in that time, people started taking ice from cold places and bringing it. And then there probably started becoming a trade where somebody would get ice and take it and put it on the riverboat and try to bring it down as quick as possible and get ice to some people that really couldn't get it. And they would get so much money out of it that would be worth his while. Because that ice could save a whole lot of people by just being able to keep their food preserved in a way. So how far does refrigerators and ice go back? Man, it goes back quite a bit, doesn't it? Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. We'll get on to another one. Peace.